The wind howled through the mountain pass as Lauren Myers stood before the altar of rough-hewn stone, her weathered hands trembling not from cold but from disbelief. Frank Morris, the man the village had paid to take her away forever, now spoke words she had never dared dream she would hear. His voice, deep and steady as the mountains themselves, cut through the storm that raged around their makeshift ceremony. "I take you, Lauren Myers, not as burden or payment, but as my chosen wife. Before these peaks that have witnessed 1,000 storms, I pledge my life to yours." The flickering candlelight caught the tears streaming down her scarred face, each drop reflecting years of rejection, cruelty, and a loneliness so profound it had nearly consumed her soul. How had she arrived at this moment? How had the daughter deemed too ugly to remain in Millbrook Village found herself beloved by a man who could have chosen anyone? 6 months earlier, the autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the narrow streets of Millbrook Village, where Lauren Myers walked with her head down, shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. At 24, she had long since accepted her place as the village outcast, the woman whose face bore the cruel scars of a childhood fire that had claimed not only her beauty, but any hope of a normal life. The accident had happened when she was 7 years old. A cooking fire had spread too quickly through their small cottage, and while her mother had escaped unharmed, Lauren had been trapped beneath a falling beam. The flames had licked across the left side of her face, leaving behind a twisted landscape of scar tissue that stretched from her temple to her jaw. Her left eye, though functional, was surrounded by puckered skin that made children cry and grown men look away in disgust. Her mother, Janet Stewart, had tried to love her damaged daughter, but grief and shame had slowly poisoned whatever maternal affection remained. When Lauren was 16, Janet had remarried a merchant named Nicholas Powell, a man who made no secret of his revulsion toward his stepdaughter. "She's a curse upon this house," he would mutter when he thought Lauren couldn't hear. "No man will ever want her. She'll be our burden until the day we die." The village shared his sentiment. Millbrook was a small, insular community nestled in a valley between towering peaks, where beauty was prized above all else in a woman. Lauren's scarred face marked her as damaged goods, a reminder of misfortune that made the superstitious townspeople uncomfortable. Children would cross the street to avoid her, and their mothers would pull them close while whispering prayers of protection. Lauren found work where she could, mostly cleaning the homes of families who could afford domestic help, but couldn't bear to look at her while she worked. She scrubbed floors, washed clothes, and tended gardens, always arriving early and leaving before the family returned home. The coins she earned were meager, barely enough to pay for the small room she rented above the blacksmith's shop. The blacksmith, Peter Powell, was Nicholas's younger brother and one of the few people in town who treated Lauren with basic human decency. He was a quiet man in his 50s, widowed and childless, who understood something about loneliness. When Lauren had approached him about renting the cramped space above his forge, he had looked at her scars without flinching and named a price she could afford. "Everyone deserves a place to call home," he had said simply, handing her the key. "The work starts early and ends late, but you seem like someone who appreciates quiet." Peter had been right. Lauren cherished the solitude of her small room, with its single window that looked out toward the mountains. In the evenings, after her work was done, she would sit by that window and watch the peaks change color with the setting sun. The mountains didn't judge her appearance or whisper cruel gossip about her future. They simply existed, permanent and indifferent, offering a kind of peace she found nowhere else. But peace was a luxury the village would not allow her to keep. The trouble began on a crisp October morning when Lauren was returning from the market with her weekly provisions. She had learned to shop early before the crowds gathered and the stairs became unbearable. As she walked past the village square, she noticed a commotion near the mayor's office. A group of men had gathered, their voices rising in animated discussion. "Something has to be done," she heard Anthony Castillo, the village's wealthiest landowner, declare. "My daughter refuses to marry while that creature still walks among us. She says it's bad luck, that any wedding held in this village will be cursed." Lauren's steps slowed involuntarily. She knew they were talking about her, but she couldn't bring herself to hurry past. The cruel fascination of hearing her own condemnation, spoken aloud, held her in place. It's not just your daughter, added Jeffrey Murphy, who owned the general store. Business has been suffering. Travelers take one look at her and decide to press on to the next town. They think we're cursed, that some plague has struck us. The children are having nightmares, chimed in another voice. My youngest won't sleep unless we check every corner of the house. She's convinced that monsters look well, like her. Lauren felt her face burn with shame, the scar tissue pulling tight as her jaw clenched. She had endured 24 years of such comments, but they never stopped hurting. Each word was a fresh wound, a reminder that she was seen not as a person, but as a blight upon their perfect little community. Mayor Brenda Cox, a stern woman in her 60s who had governed Millbrook for over 2 decades, emerged from her office with a grave expression. Gentlemen, please, we cannot simply exile a citizen without cause. Lauren Myers has committed no crime. Her face is crime enough, Anthony spat. Look at what she's done to our town's reputation. We used to have visitors, traders, young men looking for wives. Now they avoid us like we're diseased. Perhaps, the mayor said carefully, we could find a solution that benefits everyone. Lauren needs a home, and we need peace. The men fell silent, sensing that Brenda had something specific in mind. Lauren pressed herself against the wall of the building, hardly daring to breathe as she listened to them discuss her fate like she was a piece of unwanted livestock. There's a man, Brenda continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a mountain man who lives up in the high country, Frank Morris. He comes down twice a year to trade furs and supplies. He's not particular about appearances, lives alone, keeps to himself. You're suggesting we pay him to take her? Jeffrey asked, his tone suggesting the idea had merit. I'm suggesting we offer him a generous sum to provide Lauren with a home in the mountains, away from our community. She would have shelter, food, protection. We would have peace. Everyone benefits. Lauren's blood ran cold. They were talking about selling her like a piece of property, shipping her off to some stranger in the wilderness. The rational part of her mind recognized that it might be her best chance at escaping the daily torment of village life, but the thought of being handed over to an unknown man filled her with terror. How much would it cost? Anthony asked, already reaching for his purse. Frank Morris is a practical man. I'd say $50 would be sufficient to ensure Lauren's relocation. $50. Lauren's entire existence, her future, her freedom, reduced to a sum that these men could produce without hardship. She felt tears sting her eyes as the reality of her situation crashed over her. She truly was nothing more than a problem to be solved, a burden to be passed along to whoever would accept payment for taking her. When does this Morris fellow next come to town? Peter Powell's voice cut through her despair. Lauren was surprised to hear the blacksmith among the group. She hadn't noticed him before. Should be within the month, Brenda replied. He usually arrives just before the first heavy snows. And you're certain he'll agree to this arrangement? Frank Morris is a man of simple needs and practical solutions. $50 is more money than he sees in 2 years of trading. He'll agree. The conversation continued, but Lauren could bear no more. She slipped away from her hiding place and hurried back to her room above the forge, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Perhaps exile to the mountains would be better than the daily humiliation of village life. At least in the wilderness, there would be no children to scream at the sight of her, no mothers to shield their families from her cursed presence. That evening, as the forge below fell silent and Peter Powell retired to his own quarters, Lauren sat by her window and stared out at the distant peaks. Somewhere up there lived the man who would soon become her keeper, her captor, or perhaps her salvation, Frank Morris. The name meant nothing to her, but it would soon mean everything. She tried to imagine what kind of man would accept payment to take an unwanted woman into the wilderness. Surely he must be desperate, deformed, or cruel. No decent man would participate in such a transaction unless he had ulterior motives that made Lauren's skin crawl with apprehension. The days that followed were a strange kind of limbo. Lauren continued her work, cleaning houses and tending gardens, but she felt like a ghost haunting her own life. The villagers who had previously ignored her now watched her with a mixture of anticipation and relief, as if her departure were already a foregone conclusion. Her stepfather, Nicholas, had somehow learned of the plan and made no effort to hide his satisfaction. Finally, he told her mother within Lauren's hearing, "We'll be free of that burden. I can hold my head up in this town again." Janet Stewart said nothing in Lauren's defense. She had long since chosen her new husband's comfort over her daughter's welfare, and Lauren had stopped expecting maternal protection years ago. Still, the silence hurt in ways that words could not. Only Peter Powell showed any concern for Lauren's feelings about the arrangement. 3 days after the meeting in the village square, he approached her as she swept the area around his forge. "Lauren," he said quietly, his weathered hands still holding the hammer he had been using to shape a horseshoe. "I heard about the town's plan." She stopped sweeping but didn't look up. "I suppose everyone has heard by now. I want you to know that I don't agree with it. You're not a problem to be solved or a burden to be passed along. You're a person who deserves respect and kindness." The unexpected compassion in his voice nearly broke her composure. She had grown so accustomed to cruelty that basic human decency felt overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered, still not trusting herself to meet his eyes. "If you want to refuse their plan, I'll support you. You can stay here as long as you need to. I won't let them force you into anything." For a moment, Lauren allowed herself to consider the possibility of resistance. But what would be the point? Even if Peter protected her from this particular scheme, she would still be trapped in a village that despised her, still condemned to a life of isolation and scorn. "I appreciate your offer," she said finally, "but perhaps it's time for me to leave Millbrook. There's nothing for me here." Peter studied her face with the same careful attention he gave to his metalwork, looking past the scars to the person beneath. "There might be something better for you out there," he said, "but make sure it's your choice, not theirs." That night, Lauren made her decision. She would not resist the village's plan, but neither would she go as a passive victim. If she was to be exiled to the mountains, she would face her fate with whatever dignity she could muster. She began to prepare for her departure, gathering her few possessions and trying to imagine what her new life might hold. The answer came sooner than expected. On a gray morning in late October, when the first frost had painted the windows and the air carried the promise of winter, Frank Morris rode into Millbrook Village. Lauren first saw him from her window, a solitary figure on horseback emerging from the mountain trail that wound down into the valley. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about his presence. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in the wilderness, and his broad shoulders suggested strength earned through years of hard living. As he drew closer to the village center, Lauren could make out more details. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that reached his shoulders and a beard that spoke of months spent away from civilization. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable, leather and wool designed for warmth and durability rather than appearance. He led a pack horse loaded with furs and supplies, the fruits of his solitary labor in the high country. But it was his face that captured Lauren's attention. Even from her window, she could see that Frank Morris was not the desperate, deformed outcast she had imagined. His features were strong and regular, weathered by sun and wind, but undeniably handsome. This was a man who could have his choice of women in any town, yet he lived alone in the mountains by his own choosing. The realization filled Lauren with fresh dread. If Frank Morris was neither desperate nor ugly, what possible reason could he have for agreeing to take her away? The answer that came to mind made her stomach churn with fear. Within an hour of Frank's arrival, Mayor Cox had arranged a meeting in her office. Lauren watched from her window as the mountain man tied his horses outside the building and disappeared inside. She could imagine the conversation taking place, the careful negotiation that would determine her future. The meeting lasted longer than she expected. The sun had moved significantly across the sky by the time Frank Morris emerged from the mayor's office, his expression unreadable. He stood for a moment in the street, looking around the village with the air of a man taking stock of his surroundings. His gaze swept past Lauren's window, and for a brief moment, she thought their eyes met across the distance. Then he was gone, leading his horses toward the tavern where he would presumably spend the night before conducting his business with the local merchants. Lauren remained at her window long after he disappeared from sight, wondering what verdict had been reached in that office and when she would learn her fate. The answer came that evening in the form of a knock on her door. She opened it to find Mayor Cox standing in the narrow hallway, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been guilt. "Lauren," Brenda said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about your future." Lauren stepped aside to let the older woman enter her small room. Brenda looked around the sparse quarters with obvious distaste, as if the poverty of Lauren's living conditions justified what she was about to propose. "I've spoken with Frank Morris," Brenda began, settling herself on the room's single chair while Lauren remained standing. "He's agreed to provide you with a home in the mountains. You'll leave with him tomorrow morning." "Just like that?" Lauren asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "No discussion, no consideration of what I might want?" "What you want is irrelevant," Brenda replied bluntly. "This arrangement benefits everyone. You'll have food, shelter, and protection. The village will have peace. Mr. Morris will have companionship and assistance with his household needs." The way she said companionship made Lauren's skin crawl. She understood exactly what was expected of her in this arrangement, and the knowledge filled her with a mixture of fear and resignation. "What if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then you'll find yourself without work, without shelter, and without welcome in this village. Winter is coming, Lauren. You won't survive on your own." The threat was delivered with calm certainty, and Lauren knew it wasn't empty. These people had the power to make her life unbearable, to ensure that she had no choice but to accept their solution. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good." Brenda stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Pack light. Mountain life is hard, and you won't need the luxuries you're accustomed to here." Lauren almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement. What luxuries? Her few worn dresses, her single pair of boots, the handful of books she had managed to acquire over the years. Her entire worldly possessions could fit in a single satchel. After the mayor left, Lauren sat on her narrow bed and tried to process what had just happened. Tomorrow she would leave the only home she had ever known, handed over to a stranger like a piece of unwanted baggage. The village that had never wanted her was finally getting its wish. She spent the night packing her belongings and trying to imagine what awaited her in the mountains. Sleep eluded her, and she found herself returning again and again to the window, staring out at the peaks that would soon become her prison or her sanctuary. Dawn came too soon, gray and cold with the promise of the winter that was fast approaching. Lauren dressed in her warmest clothes, a practical wool dress and sturdy boots that would serve her better in the wilderness than the finer garments she had worn for special occasions. She braided her long brown hair tightly against her head and wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders, then picked up the small satchel that contained everything she owned. As she prepared to leave her room for the last time, Lauren caught sight of herself in the small mirror that hung beside her bed. The morning light was harsh on her scarred face, highlighting every ridge and valley of damaged skin. She had grown accustomed to her appearance over the years, but now she wondered what Frank Morris had thought when the mayor described his future charge. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Peter Powell standing in the hallway, his face grave with concern. "I wanted to say goodbye," he said simply, "and to give you this." He held out a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. Lauren stared at it in surprise. "I can't take your money, Peter." "It's not charity," he said firmly. "It's payment for all the work you've done around the forge over the years. I should have paid you more, but I knew you'd refuse if I offered too much at once." Lauren accepted the pouch with trembling hands, touched by his kindness even as she wondered if she would ever have the opportunity to spend the money. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. You've been kinder to me than I had any right to expect." "Every person has the right to expect kindness," Peter replied. "Remember that, wherever you're going." They walked together to the village square, where Frank Morris waited beside his horses. In the harsh morning light, Lauren could see him more clearly than she had from her window. He was indeed handsome, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His clothes were well-made and practical, and his equipment spoke of a man who knew how to survive in harsh conditions. He looked up as they approached, his gaze moving from Peter to Lauren. She saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in her scarred face, But to her surprise, there was no revulsion in his expression. Instead, he studied her with the same careful attention he might give to evaluating a horse or judging the weather. "Miss Myers," he said, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. "I'm Frank Morris. Are you ready to travel?" Lauren nodded, not trusting her voice. Frank moved to his pack horse and began rearranging the supplies to make room for her small satchel. As he worked, she noticed the strength in his movements, the easy competence of a man accustomed to handling all aspects of his life alone. "The journey will take most of the day," he said without looking up from his work. "The trail is rough and we'll need to reach the cabin before dark. Can you ride?" "A little," Lauren admitted. She had learned the basics as a child before the accident, but had rarely had occasion to practice since then. Frank nodded and led forward a smaller horse, a sturdy mare with gentle eyes. "This is Belle. She's patient with inexperienced riders. Just hold the reins lightly and let her follow my horse. She knows the way." As Lauren approached the mare, she became aware of the small crowd that had gathered to witness her departure. The villagers stood at a respectful distance, watching the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. She could see Anthony Castillo counting coins into the mare's hand, the payment for her removal from their midst. The sight filled her with a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. These people were celebrating her exile, treating her departure like a festival. She had endured their cruelty for years, but this final humiliation cut deeper than all the rest. Frank must have noticed her distress, because he moved to stand beside her, his presence somehow reassuring despite their lack of acquaintance. "Pay them no mind," he said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "Their opinions matter less than the wind." Lauren looked up at him in surprise. There was understanding in his dark eyes and something else she couldn't quite identify. Not pity, which she had learned to hate, but a kind of recognition that suggested he too knew something about being judged by others. "Mount up," he said, offering his hand to help her onto Belle's back. "We have a long ride ahead." Lauren accepted his assistance, settling herself in the saddle with more confidence than she felt. The mare stood patiently as she found her balance, then moved forward at Frank's signal. As they rode through the village square, Lauren kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give the watching crowd the satisfaction of seeing her fear or sadness. Only when they reached the edge of town did she allow herself to look back. Millbrook Village spread out below them, looking smaller and less significant from this distance. The people who had controlled her fate for so many years were already dispersing, returning to their daily routines now that their problem had been solved. Peter Powell stood alone in the square, watching their departure. When he saw Lauren looking back, he raised his hand in a final farewell. She returned the gesture, grateful for this one person who had shown her kindness in a place where kindness was rare. Then they crested the hill, and the village disappeared from view. Lauren was truly alone with Frank Morris, riding toward an uncertain future in the high country where few people ventured and fewer still chose to stay. The trail they followed was indeed rough, winding up through dense forests of pine and aspen that grew thicker as they climbed higher into the mountains. Frank set a steady pace, neither hurried nor leisurely, checking occasionally to ensure that Lauren was keeping up. Belle proved to be as patient and sure-footed as promised, navigating the rocky path with the confidence of long experience. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Lauren was too overwhelmed by the magnitude of her situation to attempt conversation, and Frank seemed content to let her adjust to their new arrangement without pressure. The quiet was not uncomfortable. If anything, it was a relief after years of whispered comments and cruel laughter. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, Lauren began to notice the beauty of the landscape around them. The autumn colors were spectacular at this elevation, with golden aspen leaves dancing in the breeze, and the deep green of evergreens providing a dramatic backdrop. The air was crisp and clean, free of the smoke and dust that often hung over the village. "It's beautiful up here," she said finally, the first words she had spoken since leaving Millbrook. Frank glanced back at her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Wait until you see the high country. This is just the beginning." His voice carried genuine affection for the wilderness, and Lauren found herself curious about what had driven him to choose such an isolated life. Most men sought the company of others, the comfort and convenience of civilization. What made Frank Morris different? How long have you lived in the mountains? She asked. 8 years, he replied. Came up here after the war ended. Found I preferred the company of trees to most people. Lauren understood that sentiment all too well. Do you ever get lonely? Frank was quiet for a long moment, guiding his horse around a fallen log that blocked part of the trail. Lonely and alone are different things, he said finally. I've been alone by choice. Lonely is what happens when you're surrounded by people who don't see you as human. The observation hit Lauren with unexpected force. He had just described her entire life in Millbrook Village with painful accuracy. How could this stranger understand her experience so completely? Is that what happened to you? She asked. People not seeing you as human? Another long pause. Something like that. Frank's reluctance to elaborate was clear, and Lauren didn't press him for details. Everyone had a right to their private pain, and she sensed that his ran as deep as her own. They stopped at midday beside a small stream that tumbled down from the peaks above. Frank helped Lauren dismount, his hands steady and impersonal as he supported her weight. She was grateful for the break. Her legs ached from the unaccustomed riding, and her back was stiff from maintaining an upright posture in the saddle. While the horses drank from the stream, Frank unpacked a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat. They sat on a fallen log to eat, the sound of running water providing a peaceful accompaniment to their meal. The cabin is still several hours away, Frank said, breaking the comfortable silence. The trail gets steeper from here. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Lauren replied, though her body protested the lie. She was determined not to be a burden, not to give him reason to regret the arrangement he had made. Frank studied her face with those perceptive dark eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see through her brave front to the exhaustion and fear beneath. There's no shame in admitting when something is difficult, he said gently. The mountains don't care about pride, and neither do I. If you need to rest more often, we'll rest. The kindness in his voice was so unexpected that Lauren felt tears spring to her eyes. When was the last time someone had shown concern for her comfort, her well-being? She couldn't remember. Thank you, she whispered, not trusting her voice to remain steady. They finished their meal in silence, then continued up the mountain. The trail did indeed grow steeper, and Lauren found herself gripping Belle's mane to maintain her balance as they navigated switchbacks that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. The village was invisible from this height, hidden by distance in the rolling hills that surrounded it. As the afternoon wore on, Lauren began to feel truly separated from her old life. The higher they climbed, the more the civilized world seemed to fall away, leaving only the eternal presence of stone and sky. There was something liberating about the vastness of the landscape, the sense that human concerns were small and temporary compared to the enduring strength of the mountains. There, Frank said suddenly, pointing ahead to where the trail curved around a massive boulder. Home. Lauren followed his gaze and saw a log cabin nestled in a small meadow, smoke rising from its chimney into the clear mountain air. It was larger than she had expected, with a solid, well-built appearance that spoke of careful craftsmanship. A small barn stood nearby, and she could see a vegetable garden that had been recently harvested for winter. The setting was undeniably beautiful, surrounded by towering peaks and dense forest, with a view that stretched for miles across the wilderness. But the isolation was complete. There were no neighbors, no roads leading to other settlements, no signs of human presence except for the cabin itself. This would be her world now, this small clearing in the vast wilderness, shared with a man she barely knew. As they approached the cabin, Lauren noticed details that spoke of Frank's solitary life. A woodpile stood neatly stacked against one wall, enough fuel to last through the harsh mountain winter. Tools hung in orderly rows on the outside walls, and a well with a simple wooden cover provided access to fresh water. Everything was practical, efficient, and built to last. Frank dismounted and moved to help Lauren down from Belle's back. Her legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground. The long ride had taken more of a toll than she had realized. Frank's hand steadied her, his touch gentle but impersonal. The altitude takes some getting used to, he said, noticing her unsteadiness. You'll feel better after a good night's rest. He led the horses to the barn while Lauren stood in the meadow, taking in her new surroundings. The silence was profound. broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a bird she couldn't identify. After years of living above a blacksmith's forge, with the constant noise of hammering and the bustle of village life just outside her window, the quiet felt almost overwhelming. Frank returned from the barn and picked up her satchel, gesturing toward the cabin. "Come on, I'll show you around." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly spacious and well-appointed. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace that provided warmth and a place to cook. Handmade furniture filled the space, a sturdy table and chairs, shelves lined with books, and a comfortable-looking chair positioned near the fireplace. Everything was clean and orderly, suggesting that Frank took pride in his home despite his bachelor status. "That's the bedroom," Frank said, pointing to a door on the far side of the room. "You can have it. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Lauren stared at him in surprise. "You're giving me your bedroom?" "You'll need privacy," he replied matter-of-factly, "and comfort. Mountain winters are hard enough without being cold at night." The casual generosity of the gesture left Lauren speechless. She had expected to be treated as little more than an unpaid servant, someone who would be grateful for whatever scraps of consideration she received. Instead, Frank was offering her the best accommodation his home provided. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Frank paused in the act of lighting an oil lamp, his expression growing serious. "What did they tell you about this arrangement?" Lauren felt heat rise in her cheeks. "They said you needed companionship and help with household tasks." "I see." Frank's jaw tightened with what might have been anger, though she couldn't tell if it was directed at her or at the people who had sent her to him. "And what did you think that meant?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Lauren found she couldn't meet his eyes as she answered. I assumed you would expect certain services from me in exchange for providing shelter and food." Frank was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Lauren, I want you to understand something. I agreed to give you a home in the mountains, nothing more. You don't owe me anything beyond basic courtesy and perhaps some help with daily tasks if you're willing. Your body's your own, and your choices are your own. Is that clear?" The relief that flooded through Lauren was so intense it left her dizzy. She had spent the entire day dreading the moment when Frank would claim what he had paid for, steeling herself to endure whatever demands he might make. To learn that he expected nothing of the sort was almost too good to believe. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you pay $50 just to give a stranger a home?" Frank moved to the fireplace and began building up the flames, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Because I know what it's like to be unwanted," he said without turning around. "And because $50 is a small price to pay for the knowledge that I've prevented a cruelty." Lauren sank into one of the chairs, overwhelmed by the day's revelations. This man, this stranger who lived alone in the wilderness, had rescued her from a desperate situation without expecting anything in return. It was a kindness so profound that she struggled to accept it. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me. Just try to be happy here, or at least content. The mountains can be healing if you let them." As if to emphasize his words, the wind picked up outside, sighing through the trees with a sound like distant music. Lauren closed her eyes and listened to it, feeling some of the tension she had carried for years begin to ease from her shoulders. "Are you hungry?" Frank asked, moving toward the kitchen area. "I can prepare something simple for dinner." "Let me help," Lauren said, rising from her chair. "I'm a good cook, and I'd like to contribute something." Frank nodded and showed her where he kept his supplies. The larder was well stocked with preserved meats, dried vegetables, flour, and other staples necessary for surviving the winter months. As they worked together to prepare the meal, Lauren found herself studying her unexpected benefactor. He moved with the easy efficiency of someone accustomed to handling all aspects of daily life alone, but he made room for her assistance without making her feel like an intruder. His hands were strong and scarred from years of hard work, and she noticed that he favored his left leg slightly, as if an old injury still troubled him. "Were you hurt in the war?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. Frank glanced at her, then nodded. "Took some shrapnel in my leg at Gettysburg. It aches when the weather changes, but it's not serious. Is that why you came to the mountains? Because of the injury? Partly. Frank's expression grew distant. The war changed a lot of things. Changed me. When it was over, I found I couldn't settle back into the life I'd known before. The mountains offered something I couldn't find anywhere else. What was that? Peace, he said simply, and the chance to live without pretending to be something I'm not. Lauren understood that sentiment better than he could know. She had spent her entire adult life pretending that the cruel words and pitying looks didn't hurt, pretending that she was content with her isolated existence. Here in the mountains, perhaps she too could stop pretending. They ate their simple meal by the light of the fire, the conversation flowing more easily than Lauren had expected. Frank was an intelligent man, well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged as he grew more comfortable with her presence. He asked about her life in the village, and she found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone, including the loneliness and rejection that had shaped her existence. I always wondered what it would be like to have a friend, she admitted as they finished eating, someone who chose to spend time with me because they enjoyed my company, not because they pitied me or needed my work. You'll have that chance now, Frank said, if you want it. The simple statement carried a weight of possibility that made Lauren's heart race. For the first time in years, she dared to hope that her life might contain something more than mere survival. As the evening wore on, Frank showed her how to bank the fire for the night and explained the routines that would help her adjust to mountain life. He was patient with her questions, understanding that everything about this environment was foreign to her experience. The nearest neighbor is 2 days' ride south, he explained as they prepared to retire for the night. We're truly alone up here. If that frightens you, I understand, but I want you to know that you're safe. I would never hurt you, and I won't let anyone else hurt you either. Lauren believed him. There was something in his manner, a fundamental decency that she recognized despite her limited experience with trustworthy men. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe. Thank you, she said as they stood outside the bedroom door, for everything. I know this arrangement wasn't your idea, but you've made it into something kind. Frank's expression softened. Get some rest. Tomorrow I'll show you around the property, help you get your bearings. The mountains can seem overwhelming at first, but they'll grow on you. Lauren entered the bedroom and closed the door behind her, then stood for a moment taking in her new quarters. The room was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in warm quilts, a dresser for her clothes, and a window that looked out toward the peaks. It was more space and privacy than she had enjoyed in years. As she prepared for sleep, Lauren reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. This morning she had been a despised outcast, sold to a stranger like unwanted goods. Tonight she was a guest in a comfortable home, treated with respect and kindness by a man who asked nothing of her but courtesy. She lay in the soft bed and listened to the sounds of the mountain night, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the settling of the cabin's wooden frame. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace settling over her, like a warm blanket. Perhaps the mountains could indeed be healing, as Frank had suggested. Perhaps here, far from the judgment and cruelty of the civilized world, she could finally learn what it meant to be valued for who she was, rather than condemned for what she looked like. Sleep came easily that night, deep and dreamless, the sleep of someone who had finally found a place where she belonged. Lauren woke to the sound of Frank moving about in the main room, building up the fire and preparing for the day. Pale morning light filtered through her bedroom window, revealing a world transformed by the first frost of the season. The meadow grass was silver with ice crystals, and the peaks above glowed pink with the early sun. She dressed quickly in the warmest clothes she owned and emerged from the bedroom to find Frank setting out breakfast. He looked up as she appeared, offering a smile that was becoming familiar. "Good morning. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," Lauren replied honestly. "The quiet takes some getting used to, but it's wonderful." "Wait until you hear your first mountain storm," Frank said with a chuckle. "The quiet won't seem so profound then." They ate breakfast together, and Lauren found herself marveling at how natural this domestic routine felt. There was none of the awkwardness she had expected, none of the tension that had characterized her interactions with men in the village. Frank treated her like a valued companion rather than an unwelcome burden. After the meal, he kept his promise to show her around the property. They walked through the small barn where he kept his horses and a milk cow, past the vegetable garden that had sustained him through previous winters, and along the creek that provided fresh water year-round. "The hunting is good up here," Frank explained as they followed a game trail through the forest. "Deer, elk, sometimes bear if you know where to look. The creek has trout, and there are berries and wild vegetables if you know what to look for." "You're completely self-sufficient," Lauren observed with admiration. "Have to be. The nearest town is a 3-day ride, and the trails can be impassable for months during winter. If you don't have what you need by October, you do without until spring." The isolation that had seemed daunting the night before now struck Lauren as liberating. Here she would never again have to endure the stares and whispers of people who saw her as a curiosity or a curse. The mountains didn't care about her scars. They judged her only on her ability to survive and adapt. As they explored, Frank pointed out landmarks and explained the rhythms of mountain life. He was a patient teacher, answering her questions without making her feel ignorant or helpless. Lauren found herself absorbing the information eagerly, already imagining herself as part of this wild, beautiful world. "There's something I want to show you," Frank said as they climbed higher up the slope behind the cabin. "Something special." They emerged from the tree line onto a rocky outcropping that offered a breathtaking view of the surrounding peaks. The vista stretched for miles in every direction, an endless panorama of stone and sky that made Lauren feel both infinitely small and somehow connected to something vast and eternal. "This is where I come when I need to think," Frank said, settling himself on a flat boulder, "or when I need to remember why I chose this life." Lauren sat beside him, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "It's incredible. I've never seen anything so beautiful." "The village you came from is down there somewhere," Frank said, gesturing toward the distant valleys. "But from up here, it seems pretty insignificant, doesn't it?" Lauren followed his gaze and realized he was right. The problems that had seemed so overwhelming in Millbrook Village now appeared small and temporary compared to the enduring majesty of the mountains. The people who had judged her so harshly were tiny figures in a vast landscape, their opinions no more significant than the chirping of insects. "I spent a lot of time angry when I first came up here," Frank continued. "Angry at the war, at the people who sent me to fight, at the world that seemed determined to break everyone in it. But the mountains taught me something about perspective." "What was that?" "That most of the things we think are important really aren't. The mountains have been here for millions of years, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Our troubles, our fears, our petty cruelties, they're just temporary disturbances in something much larger and more permanent." Lauren felt the truth of his words settling into her bones. The shame and pain she had carried for so long suddenly seemed less crushing, less defining. She was more than the sum of her scars, more than the cruel judgments of small-minded people. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said softly. "I thought you might understand it," Frank replied. "You have the look of someone who's been searching for peace." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the play of light and shadow across the peaks as clouds drifted overhead. Lauren felt something fundamental shifting inside her, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and self-hatred that had lived in her chest for so many years. When they returned to the cabin, Frank began teaching her the practical skills she would need to survive the mountain winter. He showed her how to preserve meat, how to bank the fire to last through the night, how to read the signs that warned of approaching storms. Lauren proved to be an eager student, her quick mind absorbing the lessons with an enthusiasm that clearly pleased her teacher. "You're a natural," Frank said as she successfully completed her first attempt at smoking venison. "Most people from the settlements never learn to think like the mountains require." "What do you mean?" "Planning ahead, thinking in terms of seasons rather than days, understanding that everything up here is connected. The weather, the animals, the plants, the cycles of growth and rest. City people tend to think they can impose their will on nature. Mountain people learn to work with it instead." Lauren found she enjoyed this new way of thinking. After years of living day to day, never sure when her next source of income might disappear, It was comforting to plan for the future with confidence. Here, if she worked hard and learned well, she could create a secure life for herself. The days that followed fell into a pleasant routine. Lauren took over most of the cooking and cleaning, finding satisfaction in creating a comfortable home for herself and Frank. He continued to teach her mountain skills, and she proved adept at everything from setting snares to identifying edible plants. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, sharing stories of their past lives and dreams for the future. Frank was a complex man, Lauren discovered. Beneath his quiet exterior lay a sharp intelligence and a deep capacity for both anger and compassion. He had seen terrible things during the war, had lost friends, and witnessed cruelties that still haunted his dreams. But rather than becoming bitter or cruel himself, he had chosen isolation and healing. I used to think that people were basically good, he told her one evening, as they watched the fire burn low. The war taught me that wasn't true, but it also taught me that goodness exists, even in the worst circumstances. Sometimes you have to look hard to find it, but it's there. What made you believe in goodness again? Lauren asked. Frank looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Meeting people like you, he said simply. People who've been hurt, but haven't let it make them cruel. The compliment warmed Lauren more than the fire ever could. No one had ever seen goodness in her before, had ever suggested that her suffering had created strength rather than weakness. As October gave way to November, the first snows began to dust the higher peaks. Frank became more focused on winter preparations, and Lauren threw herself into the work with determination. She learned to split wood, to mend tools, to calculate exactly how much food they would need to last until spring. We make a good team, Frank observed one afternoon as they worked together to repair a section of the barn roof that had been damaged by falling branches. Lauren felt a flush of pride at the comment. She had never been part of a team before, had never experienced the satisfaction of shared labor and mutual dependence. The feeling was intoxicating. I never thought I'd be good at anything like this, she admitted as she handed him nails for the repair. You're good at a lot of things, Frank replied. You just never had the chance to discover them. That evening, as they sat by the fire after a day of hard work, Lauren found herself studying Frank's profile in the flickering light. He was reading one of his books, his brow furrowed in concentration, and she was struck by how handsome he was. Not just physically, though he was certainly that, but in a deeper way that encompassed his intelligence, his kindness, his quiet strength. The realization that she was developing feelings for him came as a shock. She had never experienced romantic attraction before, had always assumed that her appearance would preclude any possibility of love or desire. But here in the mountains, with a man who saw past her scars to the person beneath, she found herself hoping for something she had never dared to want. The thought terrified her. What if Frank discovered her feelings and was disgusted by them? What if he decided that housing her was one thing, but dealing with her romantic longings was quite another? She could lose everything she had gained, could find herself cast out into the wilderness with nowhere to go. She tried to hide her growing attraction, to maintain the careful distance that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. But it became increasingly difficult as the days passed and their partnership deepened into genuine friendship. Frank, for his part, seemed unaware of her internal struggle. He continued to treat her with the same respectful kindness he had shown from the first day, never crossing the boundaries he had established or giving any sign that he saw her as anything more than a companion in their shared exile. The first major snowstorm of the season arrived in mid-November, announced by a dramatic change in the weather that Frank had taught Lauren to recognize. The wind shifted to the north, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter's full arrival. This will be a big one, Frank said as he secured the barn and brought extra firewood into the cabin. We could be snowed in for days. Lauren helped with the preparations, her movements efficient and confident after weeks of mountain training. She no longer felt like a helpless city dweller dependent on Frank's expertise. She had become a true partner in their survival. The storm hit that evening with a fury that took Lauren's breath away. Wind howled around the cabin with a voice like a living thing. And snow fell so heavily that the windows became opaque walls of white. The sound was incredible, nothing like the gentle snows she had known in the valley. Now you understand what I meant about mountain storms, Frank said with a grin as they listened to the tempest rage outside. Lauren found herself exhilarated rather than frightened by the storm's power. There was something magnificent about being safe and warm inside, while nature unleashed its full strength just beyond their walls. She felt connected to something primal and eternal, part of the endless cycle of seasons that had governed this land since the beginning of time. They spent 3 days snowbound in the cabin, and Lauren discovered that being confined in close quarters with Frank was anything but unpleasant. They cooked elaborate meals to pass the time, played card games that Frank taught her, and engaged in long conversations about everything from philosophy to practical matters of mountain life. It was during one of these conversations that Lauren learned more about Frank's past and the experiences that had shaped him into the man he had become. "I was engaged once," he said as they sat by the fire on the storm's second night. "Before the war, her name was Sarah, and she was the prettiest girl in our town. Everyone said we made a perfect couple." Lauren felt a stab of jealousy at the mention of another woman, but she kept her expression neutral. "What happened?" "I went to war, and she waited for me, wrote letters, sent packages, promised she'd be there when I came home." Frank's voice grew bitter. "But when I came back, I wasn't the same man who had left. The things I'd seen, the things I'd done, they changed me. I couldn't pretend to be the carefree boy she had fallen in love with." Did she try to understand? "For a while. But I had nightmares. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't bear to be touched sometimes. I'd see things that weren't there, hear sounds that existed only in my memory. She said I frightened her, that I wasn't the man she had agreed to marry." Lauren's heart ached for the pain in his voice. "I'm sorry. That must have been terrible." "The worst part was that she was right," Frank continued. "I wasn't the same man. The war had broken something in me that couldn't be fixed. So I released her from our engagement and came up here to heal, or at least to learn to live with what I'd become." "And did you? Learn to live with it?" Frank looked at her with an expression of surprise, as if no one had ever asked him that question before. "I thought I had. But lately I've been wondering if maybe I was just hiding from it instead of healing from it." "What's made you wonder that?" "You," he said simply. "Having someone to share this place with, someone who understands what it means to be hurt and to heal, it's made me realize that isolation isn't the same thing as peace." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Lauren felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "I understand about being changed by pain," she said. "The fire that scarred my face also changed who I was inside. I became someone who expected cruelty, who assumed that kindness was always temporary. Coming here, meeting you, it's taught me that maybe I don't have to be that person forever." "You were never that person," Frank said firmly. "Pain may have made you cautious, but it didn't make you cruel. That's the difference between people like us and people like the ones who sent you away. We let our suffering teach us compassion instead of bitterness." The insight struck Lauren as profoundly true. She had indeed learned compassion from her pain, had developed an ability to see past surface appearances to the person beneath. Perhaps that was why she had been able to see Frank's essential goodness, despite his reputation as a dangerous mountain man. "Do you think we can ever fully heal?" she asked. "Or are we always going to carry these wounds?" "I think the wounds become part of us," Frank replied thoughtfully. "But maybe that's not entirely bad. They remind us to be gentle with others who are hurting. They give us strength we wouldn't have had otherwise. And they help us recognize real kindness when we find it." As if to emphasize his point, the wind outside suddenly died down, leaving the cabin wrapped in the profound silence that follows a mountain storm. The contrast was so dramatic that both of them laughed, breaking the serious mood that had settled over their conversation. "The storm's passing," Frank observed, moving to look out the window. "We'll be able to dig out tomorrow." Lauren felt a moment of regret that their enforced intimacy was ending. These 3 days had been among the happiest of her life, filled with the kind of companionship she had always dreamed of, but never expected to find. When morning came, they worked together to dig paths from the cabin to the barn and well. The snow was deep but light, and Lauren found herself enjoying the physical labor in the brilliant sunshine that followed the storm. The world had been transformed into a crystal palace, every surface covered with pristine white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning light. "It's like a fairy tale," she said as they paused in their work to admire the transformed landscape. "Wait until you see it by moonlight," Frank replied. "That's when it's truly magical." That evening, he kept his promise, leading her outside after dark to witness the ethereal beauty of moonlight on fresh snow. The world glowed with silver light, and the silence was so complete that Lauren could hear her own heartbeat. Standing beside Frank in that enchanted landscape, she felt as if they were the only two people in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, not wanting to break the spell with normal conversation. "For what?" "For showing me that beauty still exists, for teaching me that I can be part of something wonderful instead of just surviving it." Frank turned to look at her, his face silver in the moonlight. "You've taught me something too." "What's that?" "That healing doesn't have to be a solitary journey, that maybe the best way to overcome our wounds is to help someone else overcome theirs." They stood there in the snow, looking at each other with an understanding that went beyond words. Lauren felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, full of possibility and terror in equal measure. She wanted desperately to reach out to him, to close the distance between them, but fear held her back. What if he rejected her? What if her feelings were one-sided? She couldn't bear to lose the friendship they had built, couldn't risk destroying the peace she had found in his company. So she simply smiled and said, "We should go inside before we freeze." Frank nodded and the moment passed. But something had changed between them. Some barrier had been lowered or boundary shifted. As they prepared for bed that night, Lauren felt the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging in the air. The days that followed were filled with the routine tasks of mountain winter, but underneath the normalcy, Lauren sensed a growing tension. Frank seemed more aware of her presence, more careful about maintaining physical distance, as if he too was struggling with feelings that couldn't be easily expressed. December arrived with a series of smaller storms that kept them close to the cabin. Lauren threw herself into domestic tasks, cooking elaborate meals and maintaining their warm, comfortable home with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. She was trying to make herself indispensable, she realized, trying to prove her worth in ways that had nothing to do with the growing attraction between them. Frank, meanwhile, spent long hours working on projects in his workshop, emerging only for meals and evening conversation. Lauren began to worry that she had somehow offended him, that her feelings were more obvious than she had hoped and were making him uncomfortable. The tension came to a head on a cold December evening when Lauren was preparing dinner and Frank was repairing a harness by the fire. She had been watching him work, admiring the skill and patience he brought to the task, when he suddenly looked up and caught her staring. "Is something wrong?" he asked, setting down his tools. Lauren felt heat rise in her cheeks. "No, nothing's wrong. I was just watching you work. You're very skilled." "Lauren," Frank said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Her heart began to race. "All right. Are you happy here? Really happy? Or are you just making the best of a bad situation?" The question surprised her. She had expected him to confront her about her obvious feelings, not to question her contentment with their arrangement. "I'm happy," she said without hesitation. "Happier than I've ever been in my life." "Why would you ask that?" Frank stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Because I've been wondering if I've trapped you here. If maybe you'd prefer to go back to civilization, find a life among people instead of hiding away with a damaged hermit." "You're not damaged," Lauren said firmly, rising from her chair. "And I'm not hiding. I'm living. For the first time in my life, I'm actually living instead of just surviving." "But you're young," Frank continued, still not looking at her. "You should have the chance to marry, to have children, to be part of a community. I can't give you those things." "I don't want those things," Lauren replied, moving closer to him. "At least not with anyone but you." The words were out before she could stop them, hanging in the air like a confession that couldn't be taken back. Frank turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Lauren, I know you didn't ask for this," she said quickly, desperate to explain before he could reject her. "I know you brought me here out of kindness, Not because you wanted a wife, but I can't help how I feel, and I won't pretend anymore that this is just friendship for me." Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she forced herself to meet his gaze, to let him see the truth of her feelings, even if it meant losing everything. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" he asked finally. Lauren's heart sank. She knew what he saw: the scars, the damaged face that had made her unmarriageable in the eyes of every other man she had ever known. "I see strength," Frank continued, his voice gentle. "I see someone who has survived terrible pain and emerged with her capacity for love intact. I see intelligence and humor and a kind of beauty that has nothing to do with physical appearance." Lauren stared at him in disbelief. You you think I'm beautiful?" "I think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever known," Frank said simply, "inside and out. The scars don't diminish that beauty. They're part of the story that made you who you are." Lauren felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy rather than pain. "I thought, I was so afraid you'd be disgusted if you knew how I felt about you." Frank stepped closer, his hands reaching up to gently cup her face. His fingers traced the ridge of scar tissue along her cheek with infinite tenderness. "How could I be disgusted by love?" he asked, "especially love offered by someone as remarkable as you." "Then you feel the same way?" "I've been fighting these feelings for weeks," Frank admitted. "I told myself it wasn't fair to you, that you deserved better than a broken-down soldier with nightmares and a hermit's life. But the truth is, I love you, Lauren. I love your courage and your kindness, and the way you brought light into this dark place I've been hiding in." Lauren could hardly believe what she was hearing. After a lifetime of rejection and loneliness, she had found not just acceptance, but love with a man who saw past her scars to the person beneath. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you almost since the first day, but I was too afraid to hope that you might feel the same way." Frank leaned down and kissed her then, a gentle touch that spoke of reverence rather than passion. Lauren had never been kissed before, had never imagined that such tenderness was possible. When they broke apart, she felt as if the world had been remade around them. "What happens now?" she asked, still hardly daring to believe that this was real. "Now we decide what we want our future to look like," Frank replied. "Together." They talked long into the night, sharing dreams and fears and plans for the life they might build together. Frank spoke of expanding the cabin, of creating a real home where they could raise children if they were blessed with them. Lauren talked about the garden she would plant, the improvements she could make to their domestic arrangements. But underneath the practical discussions lay a deeper conversation about healing and hope. They had both been wounded by life. Both had retreated to the mountains to escape the cruelty of the world. Now they had found in each other the possibility of something better than mere survival. "I want to marry you," Frank said, as the fire burned low and the night grew late. "Not because of any arrangement or payment, but because I choose you and you choose me." "Yes," Lauren replied without hesitation. "Yes, I want that too." They were married a week later in a ceremony of their own devising, speaking vows to each other in the meadow where Lauren had first seen her new home. There were no witnesses except the mountains and the winter sky, but Lauren felt the presence of something sacred in their simple promises. Frank had carved matching rings from a piece of mountain ash, and they exchanged them as symbols of their commitment to each other. The rings were simple and rough, nothing like the elaborate jewelry that wealthy women wore, but Lauren treasured hers more than any diamond. "I take you, Lauren Myers, not as burden or payment, but as my chosen wife," Frank said, his words carrying across the snow-covered meadow. "Before these peaks that have witnessed 1,000 storms, I pledge my life to yours." "I take you, Frank Morris, as my chosen husband," Lauren replied, her voice strong despite the tears of happiness that streamed down her face. "I pledge to love you through every season, to stand with you against whatever storms may come." They kissed as husband and wife, while the wind sang through the trees and the mountains stood witness to their union. Lauren felt a profound sense of completion, as if all the pain and loneliness of her past had been leading her to this moment, this man, this life they would build together. The winter months that followed were a time of deep contentment for the newlyweds. They settled into the rhythms of married life with an ease that spoke of their fundamental compatibility. Lauren continued to manage the domestic aspects of their mountain home, while Frank handled the heavier outdoor work, but they shared decisions and responsibilities as true partners. Their physical relationship developed slowly and naturally, with Frank's patience and tenderness helping Lauren overcome the fears and insecurities that years of rejection had created. He worshipped her body with the same reverence he showed her mind and spirit, making her feel beautiful and desired in ways she had never imagined possible. "You're perfect," he would whisper as they lay together in the warmth of their bed, the fire crackling in the next room and the wind singing its eternal song outside their windows. "I'm scarred," Lauren would reply, still struggling sometimes to accept his love. "You're perfect," Frank would insist, kissing the damaged skin of her face with infinite gentleness. "Every part of you is perfect to me." As winter gave way to spring, Lauren discovered that she was pregnant. The news filled both of them with joy and wonder, the promise of new life seeming to symbolize the renewal they had found in each other. "Our child will grow up knowing only love," Lauren said as they sat together, watching the snow melt from the peaks and the first green shoots appear in the meadow. "And knowing that true beauty comes from within," Frank added, his hand resting protectively over her still flat belly. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Lauren bloomed under Frank's devoted care. She had never felt so healthy or so alive, as if carrying their child had awakened something fundamental in her nature. Frank was endlessly solicitous of her comfort, taking over more and more of the household tasks as her condition advanced. "You're going to spoil me," Lauren protested one day as he brought her breakfast in bed, a luxury that would have been unthinkable in her previous life. "That's the idea," Frank replied with a grin. "I have a lifetime of spoiling to make up for." Summer brought a surprise visitor to their mountain retreat. Lauren was hanging laundry in the meadow when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Frank emerged from the barn, his rifle in hand, alert for potential danger. But the rider who emerged from the tree line was familiar. Peter Powell, the blacksmith who had shown Lauren kindness in her final days in Millbrook Village. "Peter!" Lauren called out, her voice filled with genuine pleasure at seeing her old friend. The blacksmith dismounted and approached them cautiously, taking in Lauren's obviously pregnant condition and the easy intimacy between her and Frank. "I came to see how you were faring," Peter said, his weathered face creased with concern, "and to bring news from the village." They invited him to stay for dinner, eager to hear about the world they had left behind. Peter's news was mixed. Some families had prospered, others had struggled, and the village continued its predictable cycle of gossip and petty conflicts. "There's been talk about you two," Peter admitted as they sat around the dinner table. "Some folks are saying Frank never should have been paid to take you away, that the whole arrangement was shameful." "What changed their mind?" Frank asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Your marriage," Peter replied. "Word got out somehow that you two had wed, and it's made some people uncomfortable. They're realizing that they essentially sold a woman into what they assumed would be slavery or worse, and instead she found love and happiness." Lauren felt a surge of anger at the village's hypocrisy. "So they're concerned about their consciences now that they know I'm happy?" "Some are," Peter said. "Others are just angry that their plan didn't work out the way they intended. Anthony Castillo, in particular, has been saying that Frank cheated him somehow." Frank's expression darkened. "Cheated him how? I kept my part of the bargain. I took Lauren away from the village." "That's what I told him," Peter replied. "But he's a man who likes to control things, and your marriage makes it clear that this situation is beyond his control." The conversation troubled Lauren, though she tried not to show it. She had hoped that leaving Millbrook Village would mean leaving its cruelties behind forever. The knowledge that people there were still discussing her life, still trying to exert influence over her fate, was deeply unsettling. Frank seemed to sense her distress because he reached over and took her hand in his. "Whatever they're saying doesn't matter," he told her firmly. "We're married, we're happy, and we're building a life together. Their opinions can't touch us here." Peter stayed for 3 days, and Lauren found herself genuinely enjoying his company. He was impressed by the improvements they had made to the cabin and the obvious contentment of their marriage. When he prepared to leave, He pulled Lauren aside for a private conversation. I want you to know how happy I am for you, he said sincerely. You deserve every bit of joy you found here. Thank you, Peter. That means more to me than you know. Be careful, though, he added, his expression growing serious. Anthony Castillo is a vindictive man, and he doesn't like being made to look foolish. I don't think he'll try anything, but it's better to be cautious. Lauren promised to be careful, though she couldn't imagine what Anthony could do to harm them in their mountain stronghold. Still, Peter's warning lingered in her mind long after he had ridden away. As autumn approached and Lauren's pregnancy entered its final months, she found herself increasingly focused on preparing for their child's arrival. Frank had converted a corner of their bedroom into a nursery, crafting a beautiful cradle from mountain ash, and sewing tiny clothes with more skill than Lauren would have expected from his large hands. Where did you learn to sew like that? She asked one evening, as she watched him put the finishing touches on a small blanket. My mother taught me, Frank replied. She said every person should know how to mend what's broken, whether it's cloth or wood or hearts. The wisdom in those words struck Lauren deeply. She and Frank had indeed learned to mend what was broken, both in themselves and in each other. Their love had become a healing force that had transformed two damaged souls into something whole and beautiful. The first serious threat to their happiness came on a cold October morning when Lauren was 8 months pregnant. She was preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the cabin. Frank immediately reached for his rifle, his expression grim. Stay inside, he told Lauren as he moved to the window to assess the situation. Through the glass, Lauren could see a group of 6 men on horseback, led by a figure she recognized with a sinking heart, Anthony Castillo. The wealthy landowner looked as arrogant and self-important as ever. His expensive clothes and well-groomed horse marking him as someone who believed money gave him the right to control others. Frank stepped outside to meet the group, his rifle held casually but ready for use. Lauren pressed herself against the window, straining to hear the conversation that would determine their fate. Morris, Anthony called out, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air. We need to talk. I can't imagine what we'd have to discuss, Frank replied, his tone carefully controlled. I fulfilled our agreement. Lauren is no longer in your village. That's exactly what we need to discuss, Anthony said, dismounting from his horse. The agreement was that you would take her away permanently. Instead, you married her and set up housekeeping like some kind of romantic fairy tale. The agreement was that I would give her a home in the mountains, Frank corrected. I've done that. How I've chosen to treat her is my business, not yours. It becomes our business when it makes us look like fools, Anthony snapped. Do you know what people are saying? That we paid you to take away our ugliest woman and you were fool enough to marry her. It reflects poorly on the entire village. Lauren felt her face burn with humiliation. Even now, even married and loved and expecting a child, she was still being reduced to her appearance, still being treated as a source of shame. Frank's voice when he spoke was dangerously quiet. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully, Castillo. You're talking about my wife. Your wife, Anthony laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. A man like you could have any woman he wanted. Why would you saddle yourself with damaged goods unless you were being paid to do it? Because I love her, Frank said simply. Because she's the finest woman I've ever known. And I'm grateful every day that your ignorance and cruelty drove her into my arms. The words hit Lauren like a physical blow, but this time it was a blow of pure joy. Even faced with mockery and potential violence, Frank stood firm in his defense of their love. He was willing to fight for her, to protect her, to claim her as his own regardless of what others might think. Anthony's face flushed with anger at Frank's response. Love, he spat. You can't seriously expect us to believe that a man like you fell in love with a face like hers. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Frank's rifle came up in one smooth motion, the barrel pointed directly at Anthony's chest. Get off my land, Frank said, his voice deadly calm. All of you, now. The other men in Anthony's group shifted nervously, clearly not having expected the situation to escalate to the threat of violence. But Anthony seemed too angry to recognize the danger he was in. You can't threaten us, he blustered. We have every right to reclaim what we paid for. You paid me to give Lauren a home, Frank replied. You didn't buy her like a piece of livestock. She's a free woman, and she's chosen to stay with me. That's the end of the discussion. Is it? Anthony's voice took on a sly quality that made Lauren's blood run cold. Because I've been doing some research into your background, Morris. Did you know there's still a warrant out for your arrest in Kansas? Something about desertion during the war? Frank went very still, and Lauren saw his knuckles whiten on the rifle stock. That's a lie. Is it? I have the documentation right here. Anthony pulled a folded paper from his jacket. It seems you left your unit without permission after that injury you're so proud of. Technically, that makes you a deserter, subject to military justice. Lauren's heart sank as she realized what Anthony was threatening. Even if the charges were false or exaggerated, they could be used to destroy the life she and Frank had built together. A desertion charge could result in imprisonment or worse, leaving her alone and vulnerable with a newborn child. What do you want? Frank asked, though his rifle never wavered from its target. I want you to honor the spirit of our original agreement, Anthony replied. Send the woman away. Let her find her own path in the world. You keep the money, we keep our dignity, and everyone wins. Everyone except Lauren, Frank said. And I won't abandon my wife and unborn child to satisfy your wounded pride. Then you'll face the consequences, Anthony threatened. I can have federal marshals up here within a week. They'll arrest you, and your precious wife will be left to fend for herself in the wilderness. Is that really what you want for her? Lauren could see the terrible calculation taking place in Frank's mind. He was weighing his love for her against the potential consequences of defying Anthony's demands. The knowledge that he was considering sacrificing himself for her safety filled her with both love and terror. She couldn't let him make that choice alone. Despite his earlier instruction to stay inside, Lauren opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, her pregnant belly making her movements awkward, but her resolve absolute. Lauren, get back inside, Frank said urgently, not taking his eyes off Anthony. No, she replied firmly. This concerns me and I have a right to speak. Anthony's gaze fixed on her with undisguised disgust, taking in her swollen figure and scarred face with the same revulsion he had always shown. Well, the bride herself. Tell me, what's it like being married to a man who only took you out of pity? It's wonderful, Lauren replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Because unlike you, my husband sees beauty where others see only flaws. He loves me for who I am, not what I look like. Love, Anthony scoffed. You can't seriously believe that's real? Look at yourself, woman. Look at what you are. No man could love that face. The cruel words hit their mark, and Lauren felt the familiar stab of shame and self-doubt. But before the pain could take hold, Frank's voice cut through the air like a blade. That face belongs to the woman I chose to marry, he said, his tone carrying a finality that brooked no argument. The woman who will bear my children and share my life until the day I die. And if you say one more word against her, I'll put a bullet through your heart and let the mountains bury your bones. The absolute conviction in Frank's voice seemed to penetrate even Anthony's arrogance. He took a step back, perhaps finally recognizing that he had pushed a dangerous man too far. This isn't over, Anthony said, remounting his horse. I'll be back with those marshals, and we'll see how brave you are when you're facing a hangman's noose. I'll be here, Frank replied. And so will my wife. Anthony and his men rode away, leaving Frank and Lauren alone in the sudden silence of the mountain morning. Frank lowered his rifle and turned to Lauren, his expression a mixture of love and anguish. I'm sorry, he said, moving to take her in his arms. I'm sorry you had to hear those things. I'm sorry I've brought this danger into your life. You didn't bring danger, Lauren replied, leaning into his embrace. You brought love, and whatever comes, we'll face it together. But even as she spoke the brave words, Lauren felt fear gnawing at her heart. Anthony's threat was real, and the consequences could be devastating. If Frank was arrested, she would indeed be left alone with a newborn child, facing a hostile world with no resources and no protection. That night, as they lay in bed discussing their options, Frank made a suggestion that filled Lauren with dread. Maybe I should turn myself in, he said quietly. Face whatever charges they have against me. If I can clear my name, we'll be free of this threat forever. And if you can't clear your name, Lauren asked, what happens to me and the baby then? Frank was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about that too. Peter Powell would help you, I think. He could take you back to the village, or help you get to a larger town where you could start over. I don't want to start over, Lauren said fiercely. I want to stay here with you. This is our home, our life. I won't let Anthony Castillo destroy it. What choice do we have? Frank asked. If federal marshals come for me, I can't fight the entire United States government. Lauren thought about that for a long time, staring up at the ceiling while Frank's breathing gradually evened out beside her. There had to be another way, some solution that would allow them to keep the life they had built together. The answer came to her as she watched the first light of dawn creep across the sky. It was risky, perhaps even foolish, but it was better than passively waiting for their world to be destroyed. The next morning, while Frank was tending to the animals, Lauren began writing a letter. She wrote carefully, choosing each word with precision, crafting an argument that she hoped would save everything she held dear. When Frank found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by crumpled drafts and working on what appeared to be a final version, he looked puzzled. What are you writing? A letter to the military authorities in Kansas, Lauren replied without looking up. I'm going to tell them the truth about your service record and request that they investigate Anthony's claims. Frank stared at her in shock. Lauren, you can't do that. What if he's right? What if there really is a warrant? Then we'll deal with it honestly, Lauren said, finally meeting his eyes. But I don't think there is. I think Anthony is bluffing, using forged documents to try to force us into compliance. And even if there is some kind of misunderstanding about your military service, it's better to address it directly than to live in fear. It's too dangerous, Frank protested. If you're wrong, if I'm wrong, then we're no worse off than we are now, Lauren interrupted. But if I'm right, we'll be free of this threat forever, and our child will grow up knowing that we fought for our family instead of surrendering to bullies. Frank studied her face, seeing the determination that had carried her through years of hardship and rejection. Slowly, his expression shifted from fear to admiration. You're braver than I am, he said softly. No, Lauren replied, sealing the letter with wax. I'm just more desperate. I have more to lose now than I've ever had before, and I won't give it up without a fight. The letter was dispatched with the next trader who passed through their remote valley, a grizzled mountain man who promised to see it delivered to the proper authorities in Kansas. Then began the longest wait of Lauren's life, as she and Frank tried to maintain their normal routines while dreading the arrival of either federal marshals or Anthony Castillo's return. Lauren's pregnancy was entering its final weeks, adding another layer of urgency to their situation. The thought of giving birth while under threat of arrest and separation was almost unbearable. But she tried to focus on preparing for their child's arrival rather than dwelling on possibilities beyond her control. Frank threw himself into practical preparations, stockpiling supplies and making improvements to their defenses. He cleaned and oiled his weapons, scouted escape routes through the mountains, and even began teaching Lauren to shoot, though her advanced pregnancy made the lessons awkward. I won't be able to protect you if they take me away, he said as he showed her how to load the rifle. You need to be able to defend yourself and the baby. Lauren practiced diligently, though she hoped she would never need to use the skills he was teaching her. The weight of the weapon in her hands was a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. 3 weeks passed without word from either the military authorities or Anthony Castillo. Lauren began to hope that perhaps the threat had been empty after all, that Anthony had decided the game wasn't worth the effort. But her hopes were shattered on a cold November morning when the sound of approaching horses once again echoed through their peaceful valley. This time, however, the riders wore the blue uniforms of the United States Army. Lauren's heart sank as she counted 6 soldiers, led by an officer whose bearing suggested authority and experience. Frank stepped outside to meet them, his hands carefully visible and away from his weapons. Frank Morris, the officer called out as he dismounted. I am, Frank replied, his voice steady despite the tension Lauren could see in his shoulders. Captain James Mitchell, United States Army. I'm here about some allegations that have been made regarding your military service. Lauren held her breath, waiting to see if their gamble had paid off or if their world was about to come crashing down around them. I understand there's been some confusion, Frank said carefully. My wife wrote to your headquarters requesting clarification. Captain Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. Your wife? That would be the woman who sent us a very detailed and well-reasoned letter about your service record? Yes, sir. I'd like to meet her, if I may. Her letter was quite impressive. Frank gestured toward the cabin, and Lauren stepped onto the porch, her heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure. Captain Mitchell's gaze took in her scarred face in pregnant condition without any visible reaction, his expression remaining professionally neutral. Mrs. Morris, I presume? Yes, sir, Lauren replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Your letter was very thorough, Captain Mitchell said. You presented a compelling case for your husband's honorable service and raised some serious questions about the documentation that was provided to us by Mr. Anthony Castillo. Lauren felt a surge of hope. Questions, sir? Indeed. Upon investigation, we discovered that the warrant Mr. Castillo claimed to possess was a forgery, a rather crude one, actually. Your husband's military record shows that he was honorably discharged after being wounded at Gettysburg. There are no charges pending against him, nor have there ever been. The relief that flooded through Lauren was so intense that she had to grip the porch railing to keep from falling. Frank's shoulders sagged as the tension that had been building for weeks finally released. So I'm not under arrest? Frank asked. Quite the contrary, Captain Mitchell replied. You're owed an apology from the United States Army for the distress this false accusation has caused you and your family. And Mr. Castillo is facing charges for attempting to use forged military documents to intimidate a veteran. Lauren felt tears of joy streaming down her face. Their gamble had not only paid off, it had completely turned the tables on their tormentor. Anthony Castillo, in his arrogance and desperation, had overplayed his hand and now faced legal consequences for his actions. There is one more matter, Captain Mitchell continued, his expression growing more serious. Mr. Castillo has also been charged with conspiracy to commit human trafficking. Human trafficking? Frank asked, clearly confused. The arrangement he made with you, paying money to remove an unwanted woman from his community, falls under federal jurisdiction as a form of human trafficking. Even if the woman consented to the arrangement, the fact that money changed hands to remove her against the community's wishes makes it a federal crime. Lauren stared at the captain in shock. She had never considered that the village's actions might be illegal under federal law, but now that he explained it, the logic was clear. They had essentially sold her to Frank, treating her like property rather than a human being with rights. What does this mean for us? Frank asked. For you? Nothing but vindication, Captain Mitchell replied. Your marriage to Mrs. Morris and the obvious happiness of your domestic situation actually helps our case. It demonstrates that you acted with honor and compassion, providing genuine sanctuary rather than exploitation. The captain stayed for dinner that evening, sharing stories of his own military service and expressing genuine admiration for the life Frank and Lauren had built together. As he prepared to leave the next morning, he offered some final words of reassurance. Mr. Castillo won't be bothering you again, he said as he mounted his horse. He's facing serious federal charges, and his reputation in your former community has been thoroughly destroyed. The other villagers are distancing themselves from him as quickly as possible. After the soldiers departed, Frank and Lauren stood together in their meadow, holding each other close and marveling at how completely their situation had been transformed. The threat that had loomed over them for weeks was not only gone, but their tormentor was facing justice for his crimes. I can't believe you thought of writing to the military, Frank said, his voice full of admiration. It was brilliant. I was just desperate, Lauren replied. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you and our life together. You saved us, Frank said, kissing her scarred cheek with infinite tenderness. Your courage and intelligence saved our family. 2 weeks later, Lauren went into labor on a snowy December morning. Frank had prepared as well as he could for the birth, studying medical texts and gathering supplies, but the reality of delivering their child was more intense than either of them had anticipated. Lauren labored through the day and into the evening, with Frank providing constant support and encouragement. When their daughter finally arrived, red-faced and screaming with healthy lungs, both parents wept with joy and relief. She's perfect, Frank whispered, as he placed the tiny bundle in Lauren's arms. Absolutely perfect. Lauren looked down at her daughter's unmarked face and felt a surge of protective love so intense it took her breath away. This child would never know the cruelty and rejection that had shaped her mother's life. She would grow up surrounded by love and acceptance, secure in the knowledge that she was wanted and valued. "What should we call her?" Frank asked, his finger gently stroking the baby's soft cheek. "Hope," Lauren said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." As winter deepened around their mountain home, Lauren settled into the rhythms of motherhood with the same determination she had brought to learning mountain survival. Frank was a devoted father, sharing in all aspects of Hope's care and marveling at every milestone in their daughter's development. The baby was indeed perfect, with Frank's dark eyes and Lauren's stubborn chin. But more than her physical features, Hope embodied the love and healing that had brought her parents together. She was living proof that beauty could emerge from pain, that love could triumph over cruelty. Spring brought visitors to their mountain retreat, but these were welcome guests. Peter Powell arrived with supplies and news from the outside world, including updates on Anthony Castillo's legal troubles. The man who had once wielded such power in Millbrook Village was now facing years in federal prison, his reputation and influence completely destroyed. "The village has changed," Peter told them as they sat in the meadow watching Hope sleep in her father's arms. "People are ashamed of what they did, how they treated you. Some of them have been asking if you might ever consider returning." Lauren and Frank exchanged glances, communicating without words as married couples learn to do. "This is our home now," Lauren said firmly. "We have no interest in returning to a place that showed us such cruelty. We've built something beautiful here, and we're not giving it up." Peter nodded, understanding. "I thought that would be your answer, but I wanted you to know that you'd be welcome if you ever change your minds." As the years passed, Frank and Lauren's mountain home became a haven for others who had been rejected by conventional society. Word spread through the network of trappers and traders about the couple who welcomed anyone in need, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. They took in a young man who had been disfigured in a mining accident, a woman who had been cast out for bearing a child out of wedlock, an elderly Native American who had been driven from his tribal lands. Their cabin expanded to accommodate the growing community of outcasts and misfits who found acceptance in the high country. Hope grew up surrounded by this extended family of the unwanted and unloved, learning from an early age that true worth had nothing to do with physical appearance or social status. She was a bright, confident child who inherited her mother's compassion and her father's strength. "You've created something remarkable here," Peter observed during one of his visits, watching Hope play with the other children who had found sanctuary in their mountain community. "We've created what we always needed," Lauren replied, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She was pregnant again, carrying the child who would be Hope's younger brother. "A place where everyone is valued for who they are instead of what they look like?" Peter asked. "A place where love matters more than beauty," Lauren corrected, "where kindness is more important than perfection." As the sun set over the peaks that had witnessed their transformation from outcasts to healers, Lauren reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The village's cruelty had driven her into exile, but that exile had become the greatest gift of her life. She had found not just love and acceptance, but purpose. She had discovered that her scars, rather than being sources of shame, were symbols of survival and strength. They marked her as someone who understood suffering and could therefore offer genuine comfort to others who suffered. Frank emerged from the cabin, Hope riding on his shoulders and chattering excitedly about something she had discovered in the garden. At 8 years old, she was already showing signs of the intelligence and determination that had saved her parents from Anthony Castillo's schemes. "Mama, look what I found," Hope called out, holding up a perfect wildflower she had picked from the meadow. Lauren accepted the flower with a smile, remembering another gift of flowers from long ago, when a young blacksmith had shown her the first kindness she had received in years. That small gesture had planted the seed of hope that had eventually grown into this beautiful life. "It's lovely, sweetheart," she told her daughter. "Just like you." Hope beamed at the compliment, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued. She would never doubt her worth the way her mother had. would never question whether she deserved happiness and love. As night fell over their mountain sanctuary, Lauren tucked Hope into bed and told her the story she requested every evening. The tale of how her parents had found each other in the wilderness and built a life based on love rather than appearance. "And they lived happily ever after?" Hope asked, though she knew the answer by heart. "They lived lovingly ever after," Lauren corrected gently. "Happiness comes and goes, but love endures through everything." Frank joined them for the end of the bedtime story, settling into the chair beside Hope's bed with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in his role as father and protector. The years had added silver to his dark hair and lines around his eyes, but they had also brought a peace and contentment that made him more handsome than ever. "Tell me about the village again," Hope said, her young mind fascinated by the world her parents had left behind. "Tell me about the people who were mean to Mama." Lauren and Frank exchanged glances, still protective of their daughter's innocence, even as they tried to prepare her for the realities of a world that could be cruel to those who were different. "There were people who couldn't see past the outside to the person within," Lauren said carefully. "They made the mistake of thinking that scars on the skin meant something was wrong with the heart. But they were wrong," Hope said firmly, reaching up to trace the familiar ridges of scar tissue on her mother's face. "Your heart is the most beautiful thing in the world." Lauren felt tears spring to her eyes, as they always did when her daughter's innocent wisdom cut straight to the truth of things. This child, born of love and raised in acceptance, understood something that had taken Lauren decades to learn: that true beauty resided in the soul, not in physical perfection. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "They were very wrong." After Hope was settled for the night, Lauren and Frank sat together on their porch, looking out at the star-filled sky that stretched endlessly above their mountain home. The night was peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of their community settling into sleep, the soft murmur of voices from the other cabins they had built, the laughter of children who had found safety in their sanctuary, the contented sounds of people who knew they were valued and loved. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked, his arm tightening around Lauren's shoulders as she leaned against him. "Leaving the civilized world behind for this wild place?" Lauren considered the question seriously, as she always did when Frank asked about her feelings regarding the path their lives had taken. She thought about the woman she had been 8 years ago, frightened, ashamed, convinced that she was unworthy of love or happiness. She thought about the village that had paid to have her removed like an unwanted piece of furniture, the people who had seen her scars as a curse upon their community. Then she looked around at what they had built together, a thriving community of people who had been rejected by the world but had found acceptance and purpose in the high country. Children who played without fear of mockery, adults who worked together without judgment, families formed not by blood, but by choice and love. "Never," she said firmly, "not for a single moment. This wild place taught me what civilization never could. That worth isn't determined by appearance, that love doesn't depend on perfection, and that the most beautiful life is one built on acceptance and compassion." Frank kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I love you, Lauren Morris. More today than the day I married you. And less than I'll love you tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, her hand resting over his heart. "My mountain man, my rescuer, my partner in all things." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the eternal song of the wind through the trees. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys: the daily work of maintaining their community, the preparation for their second child's arrival, the ongoing task of creating a place where the unwanted could find worth and the unloved could discover acceptance. But tonight, they simply held each other and marveled at the journey that had brought them from despair to hope, from isolation to love, from rejection to a purpose that gave meaning to every day. In the distance, a wolf howled, its voice carrying across the peaks with a wildness that spoke to something deep in Lauren's soul. She was no longer the frightened, ashamed woman who had been sold to a stranger for $50. She was a wife, a mother, a healer, and a leader in a community that valued what truly mattered. The village that had rejected her had lost something precious when they drove her away, though they would probably never understand what they had given up. They had lost the opportunity to learn that beauty comes in many forms, that strength can emerge from suffering, and that the people they consider least valuable might actually have the most to offer. But their loss had become Frank's gain, and through him, the gain of everyone who had found sanctuary in their mountain community. Love had indeed triumphed over cruelty, acceptance over rejection, and hope over despair. As they finally rose to go inside, Lauren caught sight of herself in the window glass, her reflection illuminated by the lamplight from within. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, markers of survival and transformation, rather than sources of shame. She had learned to see herself through Frank's eyes, through Hope's eyes, through the eyes of everyone who had come to their mountain sanctuary seeking acceptance. In their gazes, she saw not a damaged woman, but a strong one, not an ugly face, but a beautiful soul, not a burden, but a blessing. The woman who had once been deemed too ugly for civilized society had become the heart of a community built on love. The daughter they had paid a mountain man to take away had found not exile but home, not rejection but acceptance, not loneliness but the deepest kind of belonging. And as Frank banked the fire for the night and Lauren checked on their sleeping daughter one last time, she knew with absolute certainty that every moment of pain, every tear of loneliness, every cruel word and pitying glance had been worth it to arrive at this place of peace and love. The mountains had indeed been healing, just as Frank had promised on that first day. But more than that, they had been transformative, turning two wounded souls into healers, two outcasts into leaders, two lonely people into the foundation of a family that would span generations. Outside their window, the peaks stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the miracle of love that had bloomed in their shadow. And in the warm bed they shared, surrounded by the sounds of their chosen family sleeping safely nearby, Lauren and Frank held each other close and dreamed of the future they would build together, one act of love and acceptance at a time. The village had paid a mountain man to take away their ugly daughter, but he had married her instead. And in doing so, he had not only saved her life, but had discovered the truth that the villagers had been too blind to see, that real beauty, the kind that matters and endures, had nothing to do with the surface and everything to do with the heart. Their love story would be told for generations in the high country, passed down through the children who grew up in their sanctuary and carried its lessons out into the world. It would become a legend of hope for the rejected and the unwanted, proof that love could indeed conquer all, and that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the deepest sorrows. And high in the mountains, where the air was thin and the sky touched the earth, where outcasts became family and scars became symbols of strength, Lauren and Frank Morris lived not just happily ever after, but lovingly ever after, surrounded by the community they had built and the children they had saved, secure in the knowledge that they had turned exile into sanctuary and rejection into the deepest kind of acceptance. The wind continued to sing through the peaks, carrying their story across the wilderness to anyone who had ears to hear it. A tale of love triumphant, of beauty redefined, and of the truth that the heart's capacity for love is always more powerful than the world's capacity for cruelty. In the end, the village had gotten exactly what they paid for. Lauren Myers had indeed been taken away from their midst. But what they had failed to understand was that in losing her, they had lost something precious, while the mountain man they had paid had gained everything that truly mattered. And in their mountain sanctuary, surrounded by love and acceptance, Lauren Myers Morris finally understood what she had always been worth. Not $50 or any amount of money, but something truly priceless. The devotion of a good man and the chance to build a life based on love rather than appearance, on acceptance rather than judgment, on hope rather than despair. The mountains had made them both whole, but it was love that had made them complete.